You're listening to Econ to ICOM, thoughtful conversations with influential figures from economics and public life, exploring the economic issues they've shaped and the careers they've made. Here are your hosts, Paul Johnson and Michael Kell.
In this episode, we talked to Stephanie Flanders, one of the UK's most prominent economics journalists. You've probably come across her as the economics editor of the BBC until relatively recently, but she's also held senior roles at the Financial Times, and she's now head of economics at Bloomberg.
What's striking about Steph's career is the range of worlds that she's moved through. She's worked inside government at the US Treasury and been close to major economic decisions, but also spent much of her career explaining those decisions to a much wider audience. And that thread of explaining, of making sense of complex ideas, runs right through everything that she's done.
In talking to her, we explore how you can communicate economics well, what it takes to make complicated ideas both accurate and accessible, whether that's in a newspaper column or on the 10 o'clock news.
We also talk about the different institutions that she's worked in, from government to journalism to finance, and what she's learned from seeing how each of those operates from the inside.
We discuss how the relationship between economics and politics has changed, particularly in a world where political forces are increasingly driving economic decisions, rather than the other way around. So this is a conversation about economics in practice.
And about how we understand what's going on in the world.
This is Econ to ICON.
Hello, Steph. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, I'm very happy to be on it.
Very nice to see you. Maybe we can start sort of back at the beginning, and you could tell us a bit about what kind of kid you were and maybe what you wanted to be when you grew up.
Well, I mean, of course, we all think, kids are lovely, right? And we like to think that we were lovely kids. So I'm sure I was delightful. I do remember in terms of what came next. I had on my mother's side, a whole family, sort of generations of journalists and writers. So I definitely kind of imbued that. And my father was an entertainer and a comic songwriter. So that would probably also have come in somewhere. But not that I've tried to be funny for an economist occasionally, but that's quite a low bar. But that was definitely part of my upbringing as well, sort of music and journalism and being interested in the world. So I think at least that, I can't say I wanted to be governor of the Bank of England or economics editor of the BBC, but I was definitely interested in the world and maybe, finding my own place in it.
Your father was something of a celebrity, wasn't it? Was that something you were aware of at the time?
Yeah, he died when I was very young, but it was more that case of, people would come up to you and be just thrilled and excited about his songs, and they would sing his songs to me, even though it was a bit sort of bittersweet that I hadn't been able to see them perform or had more time with my dad as an older growing up.
How old was he?
I was 7 when he, or 6.5 when he died. So,
well, my father died when I was 10. It's pretty tough.
Yeah.
No desire ever to go on the stage?
No, I had, well, you could say, that going on the 10 o'clock news and the 6 o'clock news for the BBC was my version of that. But yes, I think I'd never sort of marked myself out as a fantastic performer, though I remember doing sort of odd little performances at home the way that, precocious children do with my friends, but nothing much more than that.
So was it that interest in the world that you described that got you interested in economics?
I think it was. I wouldn't say we were a radical family, but it was certainly a politically engaged family. My sister is and was quite radical. And probably, she was 7 years older. So there was, I'm sure, times where I was interested in things because she was interested in things. And I was growing into, secondary school in the high watermark of Thatcherism. And I think if you're interested in politics in those days, you increasingly realised you had to understand economics, or at least I did, because it felt like debates were coming down to economics. Big political reforms were being defended on economic grounds, whether it was the privatisation or the miners' strike, all of these things. I was still early teens, if that, but sort of recognising that economics was important to these things. So I did A-level economics and got sucked in. Had a great teacher, Anita Griggs, who just made me think of it as a way of understanding the world, which, as you both know, is quite hard to walk away from. Once you're wearing those economist glasses, they're quite hard to take off.
So it was the economics that attracted you to PPE?
I think it was the whole package, because as I say, it was politics that had sort of attracted me to economics. You know, I felt that economics was a route to better understanding politics. Maybe I've always been a bit of an arguer, you'll be shocked to hear. So I had thought it was a good way to win arguments, because a lot of very politically committed people were not very economically well informed, or at least so it seemed to me. And I actually, when I was at Oxford, I was most focused, I certainly got most excited about, I have to say, was potentially going to do graduate work in the political philosophy side and political theory. So it didn't, even when I was at Oxford and coming out of Oxford, it was not obvious that I would stay in economics, because intellectually the things that were really piquing my interest were more on the political theory side. And I'd got a lot out of a Immanuel Kant course, which doesn't always come up these days, but I felt was part of my kind of intellectual training when I was at Oxford, that was, the most kind of stimulating for me.
Did you follow up on that at all?
Well, I did. So when I went to Harvard after a couple of years out, working in economic think tanks, including the Institute of Fiscal Studies, while you were there, I think both of you were there, I went to Harvard originally to study a PhD in political philosophy in the political science department. But when I got there, having spent the 2 years working more on the economic policy side in those think tanks, I realised I probably wasn't going to be political science or political philosophy academic, and that those 2 years I had that I wanted to spend at Harvard would be better spent at the Kennedy School of Government doing mainly economics courses. So I think that was when I was sort of stepping away from an academic career, but also stepping away from the sort of theoretical political theory. Although I would say I've still always been more of a political economist than an economist, always trying to think about how things play in the real world and some of the political ideas at the heart of economic policy.
So what did your experience of the economics you did at Harvard, how did that kind of add and differ from the economics you'd done at Oxford, would you say?
Well, as you will smile at this, but of course it had a lot more maths for a start, because it was still in the age where I know these days to do PP at Oxford you have to have done your maths A level, but I was teaching myself calculus at Harvard because I'd managed to get away without it for quite a long time doing PPE. So there was that. But I would say there was a distinction between the courses that one did, the economic courses that you did at the Kennedy School were designed for people who were going into public policy, not people who were going to be teaching economics or having an academic career. And so they were, and I've had this conversation actually with others, Ed Balls and others who did that course. They were, by design, just much more useful for anyone in the real world trying to make economic decisions or understand economic policy. They were less theoretically pure, and the courses I did in the formal economics department at Harvard were much more mathematical, were much more based on the latest theories. But if you mentioned, the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, in any of these discussions, there was always a sort of slight air of contempt of sort of why are you introducing this kind of dirty real world concept to our very pure course on monetary theory. And ultimately that just wasn't for me. And I think possibly a few years later we kind of learned that people who had learned economics in that way were not necessarily contributing, shall we say, to the safety of the global economy in their contributions to the global financial system. When we saw the financial crisis down a few years later, that was at least in part because the economics underpinning some of these great financial innovations that we'd seen in Wall Street were quite theoretical and not necessarily based in the real world.
So I'm gonna pull us back to your career, Steph. So after a couple of years Harvard doing your MPA, then you moved, I think, back to the UK and joined the Financial Times, and I think you were mainly working as a leader writer. And I was wondering how sort of daunting a prospect that was, sort of joining that, I imagine quite sort of intellectually robust group of people and having to kind of hold your own and then articulate in a way that's going to, keep everybody maintain their confidence in you. How was that for you?
Well, as they always say, you sort of fake it till you make it. I think there was definitely an element of that. But then anyone who's been through the kind of Oxford education and all those other sort of things, that tends to go with the territory. That if you don't know about something, then you do a very good impression of knowing about it. But that was a particular. I mean, I had done an internship. I'd written to Martin Wolf, the chief economic commentator, who still is, more or less, economic commentator, though he's not leading the leader writer team anymore. He's a columnist. But I'd written to him for a summer job, in effect, while I was doing my master's. So I had spent 6 weeks, I think it was, at the FT as doing economics news reporting and also writing some leaders. So I had some experience. And actually, in the newsroom, doing the economic news just happened to coincide with the sort of follow-up to the sterling ERM crisis. This will be ancient history for anyone listening, but it had sort of given me a taste for kind of fast-moving economic events and covering them. When I came to the FT, actually to replace Ed Balls, who had gone to work for Gordon Brown as his advisor, that was obviously quite a tough act to follow. He had had a great reputation as a big, young but big economic thinker. Martin Wolf is quite intimidating, but also a fantastic teacher. And there were days when you suddenly had to get a very strong view in a few hours on something like the North Atlantic cod wars, which would just rear their heads at various times, people battling over the size of Spanish fishing nets. And I would gain a very authoritative view on that in a very short period of time. Of course, what you're actually doing is you're leaning on the expertise of many reporters and correspondents around the world for the Financial Times, talking it through with other senior editors and Martin Wolf above all, and using the economics that you'd learn. As I said, the economics I learned, particularly at Harvard, but also at Oxford, I had worked with Andrew Graham and others who'd advised governments, was of a very practical, policy-based kind. So maybe I was a little bit more relaxed with that than if I had only been doing those very pure courses at Harvard and I was only happy with a spreadsheet. I was more happy, having a good old debate about something and then writing down a few paragraphs. But there were certainly days when I was walking over. At that time, the Financial Times was on Southwark Bridge, on the south side of Southwark Bridge. And many days I would be walking over Southwark Bridge around 7:00 after the editorial had gone, thinking, oh, that should have been better. And not dreading really reading it the next day because I was thinking of lots of better ways of putting it. But that is the life of the journalist. You only have a certain amount of time to do it.
Well, I imagine it's different now, right?
Well, I would say it certainly everything has speeded up. And I look back on that job I had, and even at the time, it seemed like I have to admit now, a rather sort of idyllic job where you didn't necessarily have to get in terribly early and you had your editorial meeting at around 11:00 after reading all the papers and having your grand thoughts. And then you would sort of spend the rest of the day writing your editorial. And if you say that now to people writing leaders, let alone other parts of the paper, they sort of start to hate you because, of course, they're having to write. They have to write several a day. They're on a 24-hour schedule. They don't have this rather sort of quaint idea of producing a newspaper for the next day and that's it. I mean, we had editions. We had European edition, Asian edition. But that's, obviously all of that is now gone. You barely have a daily newspaper now. You have to have a rolling, continuous news on the FT website.
So when you did you feel like you'd arrived in your kind of milieu then when you settled into the FT?
I think there was something, and when I look back and people sort of say, was there always a plan? I mean, there certainly wasn't a plan, but I think in economic terms, my revealed preference and hopefully my revealed sort of ability was for explaining economics and explaining economics or sort of economics adjacent ideas in a simple but still kind of substantive way. And I think I was kind of honing that skill in that job, and I certainly enjoyed it. I sometimes used to wonder who on earth read these leaders, who was taking advice from the leader columns of the FT. Occasionally you would write something like, this must stop about, some bit of policy, and you sort of think, who is actually going to listen, let alone if they actually saw who was writing it. Is anyone really going to stop doing anything because the FT tells them to? But aside from those kind of meta concerns, I think I was kind of gravitating to what turned out to be, a common feature of a lot of the jobs I've done since.
But after not that long at the FT, I think you went back to the US, and where you got a job working as a speechwriter to Larry Summers, who was the US Treasury Secretary then. And I'm wondering whether part of the motivation for that was because then you're not wondering about who you're influencing or potentially influencing in what you're doing. You're right there in the room.
No, well, yes. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, there is always a question that people ask about: are you talking about something? Are you an observer or a doer? And as I mentioned, I'd already seen sort of Ed Balls go to be extremely influential in the then what became the Blair government, working for Gordon Brown. And because my mother was American, I had a dual nationality. I'd got to know in writing the leaders, I'd got to know the senior folks in the US Treasury, including David Lipton, who was then the senior international affairs official. And when he found out that I had a US passport, which meant that I would be able to work for the government at a reasonably high level and pass all the sort of security things of ours, he was really quite keen for me to fill what had previously been quite a tough role to fill, which was the speechwriter to Larry Summers, who you'll be shocked to hear was quite demanding and didn't always want to read the speeches that people gave him. But yeah, I was very attracted to not just seeing the US influence over international economic policy, but also to see it through the eyes of and be close to the sort of decisions of someone like Larry Summers, who, obviously has a bit of a cloud over him these days, but has an unquestioned economic mind, and was to have someone who was a very highly respected economist academically, who had been, chief economist of the World Bank and other things, sitting in that kind of power. He later became Treasury Secretary. When I joined, he was actually Deputy Treasury Secretary, but he was very much in charge of the international economic policy for Treasury and most of the sort of core economic policy decisions. And yeah, that was just a hard job to turn him down when you are literally in the room seeing those decisions being made. And that was my only condition for going, was I didn't mind writing the speeches, but I didn't want to be just sitting in a room writing speeches. I wanted to be part of the conversation. And I realized when I got there that was kind of always the way, because it's part of the process of thinking about policy, thinking about how you're going to describe it to people, which is where the speech comes in.
What were the big issues of the day?
The big issue, in fact, I think one of the last editorials I wrote for the FT was on the day of the Thai devaluation. Thailand had a devaluation of its currency, which turned out to be the start of the Asia financial crisis, which was a really big deal for a while, but then was completely eclipsed a few years later by the global financial crisis. But the period 1997 to 1999 that I was sitting, and early 2000 that I was sitting in the US Treasury, was dominated by first that Asia crisis and how the IMF and others responded to that, the sort of various bailouts for countries like Korea and Thailand and Indonesia to prevent those currencies completely collapsing and preventing defaults in those governments. It then sort of later moved, that same sort of wave of financial pressure moved across more emerging market economies. Remember, you had the Russian default in the summer of 1998. You had various crises in South America and Brazil. So at the time, it felt like we were fighting a lot of financial fires around the world, which caused a lot of headlines, even though actually ultimately didn't have a big economic effect on the core economies of the US and Europe. It certainly was a big focus of our activity. And we had a big influence over how the IMF responded to those things.
My impression as well is that a lot of the Asian economies affected recovered pretty well. That crisis didn't have the long-term impact that the later global financial crisis had. Is there anything to learn from that?
I think, it's interesting, right? Because at the time it was quite controversial, some of the advice that the IMF, with support from the US, was offering to these countries. There were some pretty hard-nosed decisions. I think several hundred Indonesian banks, they were told as a condition of their IMF program, I think I'm right in saying, had to be closed down, which is pretty tough for the people on the ground. When it came to the US global financial crisis or the US banking crisis, as Larry Summers later admitted, it's quite a lot harder to then to talk about closing banks when it's your own banks as opposed to someone else's banks. But I mean, I think many people would look at the response of those economies. It's true, there was a very dramatic decline and then recovery over the course of about a year for most of these economies. They had a massive fall and then were able to have a very rapid recovery, which, I mean, arguably you also saw in somewhere like Greece. You actually had, you had quite a bounce back in Greece. Ironically, when countries are given more support and don't have to take quite the same really kind of aggressive moves in the first few months, sometimes that does mean the crisis just kind of drags on and you never quite come out of it. But the big lesson that all those countries drew from that period was they never want to be in that position again. And they certainly never wanted to be going cap in hand to the IMF or others, the US, for the money they needed just to cover their imports. So they sort of doubled down not only on a kind of export-led strategy, but also on building up their reserves. And at least in some people's minds, that helped contribute to the global financial crisis because you got these big global imbalances and massive stocks of savings sitting in or being built up in Asian economies looking for a home and potentially, going into US debt and sort of forcing interest rates down globally below where you'd expect. I mean, there's a lot of economics that are involved in that, but the sort of savings glut that people talk about that sort of pushed interest rates down and potentially led to a rather kind of dysfunctional global environment. Some of the seeds for that, at least some would argue, were laid in the Asia financial crisis.
If I could just add a personal reflection, because I was working in the UK Executive Director's office around that time. And one of the lessons I took from that was to see how influential the US is in terms of deciding what the IMF does. And I wonder how kind of widely appreciated that is by people who haven't kind of seen the degree of the US muscle, certainly at that time anyway.
No, absolutely. I mean, obviously I was sitting there with a US hat on, but I'm, half British and had exactly the same feeling. I thought it was extraordinary how, when it came down to it, how influential the US could be, even with its sort of nominally relatively small shareholding, but I think it's 14%, but it's the biggest, bigger than anyone else. And you also saw how the US only really wants to play in institutions that it controls. And I'm reminded of that when we obviously were very, many people wringing their hands over the Donald Trump's sort of rejection of global international institutions in norms. But the US has never really wanted to be subject to other countries' votes or wishes. They only tend to want to use institutions that they can ultimately control. So the UN Security Council, where the US has a veto, they take a bit more seriously than the General Assembly, where they just get outvoted all the time. So as a result, the General Assembly tends to be not very effective. And the IMF is able to do a lot of things, in part because it is very influenced by the US. But I did see, one thing that was a very striking feature of my time as well was a kind of a rather benign competition between Larry Summers and Gordon Brown, who were both quite keen to get their initiatives on the table. And often the initiatives were things that actually did make the world a better place, like debt relief for the highly indebted developing countries. And you do look back on those times and think, gosh, I wish countries were competing now for who could, be the one who had the most effective debt relief program for Africa. To have those sort of two men both wanted to get credit for these things, I think in the end, was quite beneficial for the world.
So after a period working with Larry Summers, you kind of moved back to the UK. So in a sense, kind of giving up your sort of seat close to the real power in the global economy and move back to the UK. So maybe you could say a little bit about that, what was behind that move, and then maybe you can also then tell us a bit about your time at the BBC.
Well, the short term reason was there was I don't know how many hundred votes in certain counties of Florida, which Miami-Dade, I seem to remember, was that, that 2000 election, I think if Al Gore had won that election, Larry Summers would have continued to be Treasury Secretary, I'm pretty confident, and I would probably have carried on working for him. So the immediate reason why I wasn't working close to power, as you put it, was that we were no longer in power after January 20th, 2001, after that sort of extraordinary tussle over the result of that election. And I did actually initially go and work for the New York Times, which would have been on a kind of global development job, and just didn't, it's a good lesson for people listening. Not everything goes right on these things. I just didn't get on, although it was on paper the dream job. And I had a few months on the local news desk to get acclimatized to the New York Times, which I enjoyed immensely. But just it wasn't a good fit sort of culturally, institutionally. I found people at the New York Times, I think I can say this, but took themselves more seriously than the Treasury Secretary did. It was just a sort of, or in many cases anyway. And it was sort of a good example of, you walk in a place and actually you almost immediately, that something doesn't work. And 9/11 also, the downing of the World Trade Center happened just as I was going to be moving over to this new job, this dream job. And so that was it was derailed by that. And I ultimately just decided to leave because I could just see it wasn't going to work out. And I recommend to anyone listening, if they have the capacity, and not everybody does obviously, but if you have the capacity to walk away from a job that you're not enjoying, it is an immensely liberating experience and self-affirming experience. And it's definitely worth building up a bit of savings if you can to be able to have that freedom. And I then had some time working for the UN and other people. And then the BBC came along when Evan Davis became economics editor of the BBC. There was an opening for economics editor on Newsnight. He'd done that job very well. And I had been talking over the years to the BBC about potentially coming in. But so I moved back to London and started to learn how to do economics on TV. But yes, I would recommend, often, you don't always pick the right job. It's quite good to try out different jobs in different institutions, but then be honest about things when they're not working.
Well, just on that, Steph, you must have figured out quite quick that the New York Times wasn't for you, because you were only there, did you say 6 months?
I was there for 6 months, and I had, in fact, 4 months of that was, as per the plan, was on the local news desk, which I did enjoy. It was probably the only local news reporting I will ever do. But there was a combination of things. It's like anything, the person who'd hired me was the executive editor, who then left when I arrived. So it was partly about a change of personnel. There had been question marks about the job, which had sort of been his brainchild. So then you have less institutional support for the thing that you're going to do. And then that combines with, I think I was just, I think the New York Times is absolutely terrific. It was a great newspaper then, and then I think it's an even more powerful institution now. It's been doing some amazing reporting. So this isn't really against the New York Times, but you can have a place that is a great place to work, but is not a great place for you to work. And that was definitely the lesson for me that I did learn fairly quickly.
Yeah,
I can relate to that from one experience that I've had. What about being a TV journalist, though? I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, in some ways, it seems much harder than being a writer of economics, because you get much smaller clips and presumably have to be much more succinct and, without being rude, a bit more dumbed down. I mean, did you find that frustrating?
Well, you've combined lots of things there, because I think, Paul, when you were saying being a TV journalist, you didn't quite have it, but some people, have a slight turning up of the lip when they say a TV journalist, with a slightly sort of contemptuous.
No, I didn't mean it that way at all.
Then you made up for it by pointing out how difficult it is, which I suspect I've probably drummed into you over the years in the conversations we've had. When I went to that job, a number of people, my previous colleagues at the FT and also sort of economists and others that I knew from the policy world, they were a bit surprised that I should sort of go, quote unquote, down market doing TV, even though this was Newsnight, which people might see Newsnight today, but Newsnight was a longer program in those days, had a lot more kind of 5 to 10 minute films in them, and did a lot more kind of explaining of policy. It wasn't just people discussing things live in the studio. So it was the sort of high-end bit of TV journalism, but obviously is very different. You're talking to a different audience than people reading editorials in the FT. And to your point, I think TV audiences, I mean, it is a harder thing explaining economics in a leader to people who read the FT and therefore have a kind of broad understanding of quite a lot of global economic concepts is much easier in many ways. There's a lot of knowledge you can assume when you're writing for TV or trying to produce a film for TV, especially when I later went on to the bigger economics editor job where you're on the 10 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock news and you're also doing things on the radio. It is intellectually the much bigger challenge because I'm trying not, when I was doing that, I was trying not to be, I mean, it's dumbed down highbrow as the way I thought of it, that you want to be clear and understandable to, 11-year-olds, say, or a 10-year-old, but not be saying something completely banal. And obviously you don't always, I had the equivalent often of that walking across Southwark Bridge feeling again, that you sort of, I don't feel like I've really said anything. But that the ideal is that you find a way to use pictures and words to get across a concept which is also a substantive concept in economics. I remember one example I remember was when we were taking a long time to come out of the global financial crisis, and there was really quite a lot of spare capacity in the economy. And as you know, Paul, there's a debate about when spare capacity has just been sitting around too long to really be effective, and then you've lost it forever, and then you've permanently lost output. And I was trying to find a way to express this on TV, apropos some GDP numbers. And we actually, my excellent then producer, Kirsty Good, found a cement factory that had closed was still keeping the fire burning in one of those sort of massive furnaces that they have to make cement. But they weren't making cement, but they had to keep it burning in order to still have the capacity to use it again. And there was going to be about 2 years that they could keep it running before they had to just turn it off. And once you turn off the furnace, you can't start it again for various reasons. And we had this great visual demonstration. There were the two furnaces, one going, the other one not going, for the idea of when, the risk of a permanent loss of capacity if the economy kept going slowly. And that was one of the ones that I had quite a few phone calls and texts from economists saying, I love the way you've managed to find a way to capture this.
I was thinking as you were saying it, that's brilliant. That's wonderful.
Well, I'd say it was down to my then producer, Kirsty Good, for finding, it's easier to say, quite hard to find. But, if you've managed to do that, often it wouldn't be in terms of a physical thing, a factory. You can't always be so lucky, but you'd be trying to think of a graphical way of representing that. But, the idea was that you wouldn't just be saying something completely simple and banal, but you would still, but to say something sophisticated in a way that everyone can understand. I mean, that's the dream. I can't say I've always been able to do it, but that's what the intellectual effort is for.
I can see that, colleagues like producers would have been, extremely helpful in suggesting how best to convey certain sorts of concepts. But I'm imagining you weren't surrounded by many other people who, were that necessarily had much of a background in economics. And I wondered, well, A, is that true? And B, was that kind of invigorating? Because in the land of the blind, the one-eyed person is king / queen. Or is it a bit scary?
Well, I was going to say, it would be invigorating if it was just your colleagues who were going to hear your explanations. But given that you're going to put your explanations out on the airwaves, and there will definitely be someone in the audience who knows if you said something stupid, it is more in the scary category. Look, I was very lucky to have some colleagues who did have a good understanding of economics, particularly Evan Davis, obviously, who, we would sometimes chat through things. And Robert Peston certainly thinks he understands economics, and but he will also admit that he didn't often pay very much attention to his economics tutorials. But he's learned a lot of economics along the way, and when we were both, when he was business editor and I was economics editor, we would definitely talk things through and debate things. Not always agree, but we would certainly debate economic issues. But you're right, there's a certain vertigo on the night when you're you've got your script, you've got producers who have a lot of experience in economics and business producing, but not necessarily economics background. They're reading your script. Very few other people are reading your script. And you just have to be trying to absolutely make sure that you're being fair and rigorous and not getting anything wrong. And of course, occasionally I did make mistakes, but I'm glad to say there was, I think in my time, only one or two serious complaints about things I'd done, and none that actually fully came to fruition.
It's a very exposed position, isn't it? Being, I think, particularly the BBC as economics editor, because you've got lots of people watching you, and lots of people ready to complain and criticise what you're doing, and a very difficult set of things to get across. You moved from there into the city, JP Morgan. What did you learn from actually? I suppose that was the closest you came to being. I mean, I think you were sort of an advisor and economist there rather than trading anything, but that's probably the closest you came to actually being in an organisation which was actually taking part in the markets.
Yes, I mean, it is a bit like I've sort of had this long lifetime sort of tour of the global economy or global financial system, sitting in, as one of my friends said when I went to JP Morgan, you've gone out of one very large building and then quickly crossed the road and gone into another very large building. I have been a creature of large buildings. I've worked in these sort of big institutions, but each with their slightly different positions in the global economy, whether it's the US Treasury or BBC or JP Morgan. You're right that I wasn't trading, and it's probably good news for JP Morgan that I wasn't doing trading, but I was on their asset management side, again, kind of explaining what was going on in economies and markets and talking to their JP Morgan clients, but also internally about where the world was going, where the economy was going. For me, it was about, it was partly that I'd been at the BBC for 11 years and some of the job was sort of starting to repeat itself. I've been doing the same things a lot. It's also quite nice to have control over your evenings, which you don't really get if you're a BBC economics editor. Every time you think you're sitting down to a nice dinner and then you get a phone call and you're not doing that, you're going on the 10 o'clock news. After a while, that becomes a bit less exciting and just annoying. So for a slightly quieter life and to sort of get a better understanding of the global financial markets, I went to JP Morgan, and it was fascinating to see. I mean, obviously I was very lucky that it was JP Morgan, which is probably the most successful bank on the planet. And as a major private company, a very well-run institution. So to see that even just that aspect was fascinating to sort of see from the inside what a well-managed institution looks like on the private sector. And yes, to understand...
Is that a deliberate contrast with the BBC?
Well, as I said, that's why I added private, because I sort of think it sounds like a dig to the BBC. It's certainly the BBC is run for the license fee holders and is just a completely different animal, as is the US Treasury. But I guess I had a sort of anthropological interest in, how these different institutions run and the pros and cons of different kinds of management. But I also had this rather sort of idealized view of bonds and stocks and bonds and how markets worked. And to see how investors, people actually at the sharp end, thought about markets. And frankly, also to get a sense of, how much, if I'm allowed to say bullshit, certainly how much kind of just made up nonsense people talk about the markets when they're talking to investors and trying to persuade them to do things. All of that was quite salutary and interesting. But all of that was sort of what I learned from sitting in that particularly prime position in JP Morgan.
So it's not all well-informed and rational, as we economists like to think.
Well, quite so. But they also have, for me, it's also been about understanding different sort of species of people. I mentioned the anthropology, but, if you're at the BBC, you get to meet a whole different sort of species of people in these different institutions, whether it's, the picture editors who do magical things with film at the BBC and cameramen who can, find exactly the way to film something to be able to tell a certain story. Then you go to at JP Morgan, there were people who were salespeople who I'd not worked closely with people who were motivated by selling investment funds before, and I was on the road with them learning what made them tick. Since I've come to Bloomberg, you're sort of meeting not just economists and journalists, but also engineers who were sort of doing the hard wiring behind the Bloomberg terminal, and that is a whole other species of person. So for me, it's also been about sort of collecting different kinds of people and seeing if I can get along with all of them.
Yeah, that makes me think about, one of the, I guess, insights I felt I got through my career as I started to work with more and more people who weren't economists is that in my case, I shouldn't lump you in with this. It does dispel this notion, which I think certainly academic economists, some of them are guilty of, which is, it's only economists who understand things. And, they have a monopoly on understanding. And of course, as you become exposed to different types of experts, you see how that's certainly not the case.
Yeah, I don't think the economists are labouring under that delusion any longer, but anyway, maybe they're wrong. We've been proved wrong by so many events.
So you mentioned Bloomberg, Steph, which is you joined, I think, in 2017, and that's where you are now. I mean, maybe you should just enlighten us and just tell us what is Bloomberg, what does it do, and then what do you do there?
So Bloomberg started 40 years ago or so, I'll probably get that slightly wrong, as a way of just introducing transparency into US Treasury markets, which sounds a bit boring. But it was, at that time, the banks, the big US banks really were the only ones who knew the price of US government bonds. And that's obviously a pretty important market. And Mike Bloomberg, I was simplifying enormously, but Mike Bloomberg just thought that there was a market for providing everyone in the financial system, anyone in the financial market, with the same information about the pricing of different assets, primarily treasuries at that point, but then it became basically everything in the global financial system. So that's the kind of core part, the sort of original part of the Bloomberg empire, which produces the money. But as part of that, there's always been a news service, which again started off just as a traditional sort of wire agency competing with Reuters and Associated Press, particularly Reuters, and then has grown into a sort of global journalism empire, particularly under John Micklethwaite, who's still now the editor-in-chief, who was editor of The Economist. And we own Business in Business Week, the weekly magazine. We have a website which is very similar to sort of the Financial Times website in terms of the cost of it, or Wall Street Journal. So people can engage with Bloomberg as just another news provider. You don't have to have the sort of all bells and whistles, much more expensive Bloomberg terminal in the markets. But we have a sort of particular position where we're sort of in the markets, but not of the markets. We're very close to all the people who are trading, and we're relied upon. We can certainly move markets. If one of my colleagues makes a mistake, for example, in saying, what the European Central Bank interest rate decision is, that will move the markets until it's corrected. That, which is obviously, puts a lot of power in their hands. It doesn't happen very often, I'm glad to say. But in my job, I joined in order to bring all the economic expertise together. So we have a team of economists that I've grown to about 65 people. But there's also about 100 economic reporters, and I've now also got the political reporters, so it's about 200 economic and political reporters around the world. And I'm marshalling them together to, I hope, give the sort of best account of what's happening in the global economy and global politics.
Sounds absolutely amazing. But I guess it gives you a wonderful seat to observe what's going on in the world. I mean, so in the last few minutes, I think we need to discover what's going on in the world. I mean, what is your view?
Quite a lot, Paul. Quite a lot.
Yeah,
Paul.
Absolutely. I mean, what is your view of the big? Let's stick with the economics rather than the politics. The big economic challenges facing us over the next year.
I mean, I think it's not even the next year, is it? I mean, the big change that's happened in the time since, we were all at the Institute of Fiscal Studies in the early 90s, mid-90s. I talked about going into economics because it was driving policy and driving politics. Of course, we've gone full circle where it feels like politics and populism, indeed, and concerns about national security are kind of driving economics in a way that's not been true in my lifetime. You have US administration that's using economic tools to achieve national security objectives. And we've seen that in spades in the last year with tariffs. but also obviously an administration that's willing to just sort of upend global norms and rules and institutions. And I think, the overriding thing that does for people thinking about economics, and indeed for businesses and others just sort of thinking about where the world's going to go, is, it used to be that people were making economic decisions with a fairly benign geopolitical kind of political backdrop. And if anything, governments were kind of in favor of globalization. They were in favor of more integration rather than less. They were possibly introducing market reforms to make the economy more kind of market-led, more integrated in the global economy. And businesses, everybody kind of made decisions on that basis. That's just gone now. Instead, you have this very fractious background where you can't count on governments to support integration. In fact, if anything, you can count on them to want to close up and to turn inward. And I think it sort of changes, and in a way, I envy and don't envy people learning economics today, because it's quite hard to see where the fixed points are with that, because you can make a decision, you can get your demand and supply curves and your cost benefit analysis, but at any minute, there may be a bit of government policy that's just going to turn it on its head, and it may not be one, the policy may not be grounded in any kind of economic rationality.
And I mean, obviously, the big economic news over the last year, which is totally relates to what you just said, is Donald Trump's view of the world and tariffs. But I mean, to what extent do you see that we really are moving away? I mean, is this the part of a real longer term trend away from integration, globalization, and free markets? And if so, why are stock markets doing so well at the moment? I mean, it's one of the things I find difficult to get my head round, which is that some doom and gloom, it seems. All of us economists are being miserable about what Donald Trump's doing, and the British economy is struggling along, and yet the FTSE is kind of zipping ahead, and the Nasdaq has gone bananas. I mean, what is your sense of how to make sense of all of those different things? And are we living, which is right? Are the markets right to be so happy? Are we wrong to be so miserable?
I mean, obviously, there's a lot there. I think there's a short-term reason why markets, particularly in the US, have been a bit more kind of upbeat than you would have expected, given the uncertainty involved. And I think that is obviously AI, that there's just been enormous investment in AI and hope and expectations and forecasts around the potential of AI, which have sort of swamped anything else. And if you look, that's true in a real sense. If you look at the amount that the stock market's gone up, and then how much of that is just a handful of companies, probably 7 companies or even fewer than that, who are heavily involved in the AI, sort of rolling out of AI and investment in AI. So, one response to what you're saying is, well, that stock market enthusiasm, at least in the US, is very narrowly based and potentially quite vulnerable if we start to see companies say, I can't make any money out of AI. I can get everyone to use it, but I can't make any money out of it. A kind of slightly more political answer would be that if you look at what has come with the rise of populism has been largely in the rightward direction. We haven't seen countries lurch yet anyway, lurch to the left and lurch to have, big increases in wealth taxes, for example, or, concerted efforts to redistribute income more than is already happening. Instead, we've actually seen, if anything, things moving in the other direction. Well, if you're an owner of capital, as reflected in the stock markets, that's a world, that's kind of amenable to you. You don't have to worry so much about higher taxes. So I think there's that sort of slightly more cynical element, that even if we might be worried about the lack of global rules, but the default seems to be, with a system without a populist world will still be one that's quite good to capitalists, at least in the short run. I would argue in the long run, the sort of capriciousness of policy and the uncertainty involved in sort of losing some parts of the rule of law and the kind of reliability of institutions, I think is, costly to everyone, including capitalists. But that's a very long-term risk which people in the markets are probably underpricing at this point.
Steph, for my final question, I want to come back to your career, and I'd be interested in your reflections on what do you think the personal qualities that you've got and have demonstrated, what are the qualities that have kind of underpinned your career and the successes that you've had, would you say?
So that's a dangerous question, because if people have managed amazingly to get this far, they will, if I may say things that sound at odds with what they've heard, but I do seem to I have had a desire to explain things to people, and I've enjoyed sort of finding ways of explaining things to people, which has apparently stood me in good stead. I have always been curious about different institutions, different kinds of people, wanted to get along with different institutions and different kinds of people, seem to have been quite good at that. I think the other thing I've noticed actually as I've gone on is I don't assume everyone's out to get me, and a surprising number of people I work with do. And I think that's quite a sort of useful, occasionally people are out to get you and you end up looking a bit naive, but it's a sort of, I have found that just in general, it's a route to a slightly happier, less stressful life if you sort of assume that there isn't a big conspiracy against you. Oh, and the other one I would say is I have not, if we're sort of verging into advice territory, I would say I have been quite confident in myself, and I'm sure, people have said sometimes I come across as overconfident or intimidating, but I have, you have to always be doubting and questioning your facts and your, what you believe. And the people I've admired most through my career, and the people I've learnt most from, whether it's, Martin Wolf or John Kay, who I worked with right at the start of my career, people like Andrew Dilnott and even Larry Summers actually, are people who are kind of intellectually honest in the sense of they're willing to follow arguments where they lead, even if it's in places that they don't necessarily, weren't their initial view. And that's something I would always aspire to as well.
Which does, of course, take a confident, that requires a level of intellectual confidence, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great advice. Don't think the world is out to get you, and be intellectually open to the evidence. And what more could you ask?
Whether we always succeed is another matter, but yes, that's the hope.
Thank you very much for listening to that edition of Econ to Icon. If you're interested in any of the issues raised in any of the economics, do stay in touch. Do, of course, consult the website of my old organisation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. There's a couple of books you might enjoy. One called Follow the Money, strangely enough, by me, which looks at all of the public spending and tax issues we face, and even more recently, published in the last month or two, Challenging Inequalities, which looks at the whole issue, as you can imagine, of inequality in the UK.
And if today's conversation got you thinking about your career and what might come next, then I offer one-to-one coaching. And you can find out more about that on my website, michaelkellcoaching.com.
And do, of course, listen to the next edition of Econ to Icon.